What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today. At the time that I'm recording this, college football returns 2 months from today, and we will have arrived at week 0. I cannot wait, but in the meantime, before we get there, for today's episode, I wanted to preview another team that I believe is flying heavily under the radar and who could make a significant amount of noise in 2024 if a couple of pieces fall into place. The Syracuse Orange are a team that I know the majority of college football fans aren't expecting much from in 2024, but throughout this episode I wanted to lay out a few major reasons why they might be a contender, not just for an ACC title, but potentially a long shot dark horse for the 2024 12-team college football playoff. Syracuse went 6-7 last year, ending their season with a loss to USF in the Boca Raton Bowl, but they started their season very well, beating their FCS opponent Colgate 65-0. They beat Western Michigan 48-7, won on the road at Purdue 35-20, and beat Army by 2 touchdowns. They fell into a little bit of a slump, though, in the middle of the season, losing 5 straight to Clemson, North Carolina, Florida State, Virginia Tech, and Boston College. They then beat Pitt by 15, lost on the road at Georgia Tech by 9, and capped off the regular season beating Wake Forest 35-31. In their bowl game, they got just absolutely rocked by USF 45-0 in the roofclaim.com Boca Raton Bowl, but they were playing with a very depleted roster, which I'll touch on in a few minutes. In 2024, though, their schedule looks a little bit different. According to the ESPN FPI, Syracuse has the 82nd strength of schedule, which is the easiest of any team in the Power 4. To reiterate, they have, as of now, the easiest schedule of any Power Conference team. If you're listening on podcast in 2024, Syracuse plays Ohio, Georgia Tech, Stanford, Holy Cross, at UNLV, at NC State, at Pitt, Virginia Tech, at BC, at Cal, UConn, and then they wrap up the regular season at home against Miami. So first things first, they start the season with 4 consecutive home games. They get Ohio, Georgia Tech, Stanford, and then their FCS opponent Holy Cross, all at home in the first 4 weeks of the season. They don't play a road game until the month of October, which is a perfect scenario for a first-year head coach, which the Orange have in Fran Brown. Syracuse fired Dino Babers and hired former Georgia defensive backs coach Fran Brown right after last season, so they get to ease into things a little bit with 4 straight home games to start the year. Their non-conference schedule consists of Ohio and Holy Cross, and then UNLV and UConn. Additionally, their ACC schedule has both of the former Pac-12 additions to the conference in Stanford and Cal, but what's even more important is who their conference schedule doesn't include. Here's where things could get pretty interesting in regards to truly what kind of season Syracuse can have this fall. In 2024, Syracuse doesn't play Clemson, Florida State, Louisville, or North Carolina. Those 4 teams have entirely comprised the last 2 ACC Championship games. In 2022, the ACC title was Clemson-UNC, and then last year it was Florida State-Louisville. So Syracuse doesn't play any of them. They also don't play SMU, who won 11 games and won the AAC title last year, and is 7th in odds to win the ACC after making the conference change. They play just 3 teams in the top 9 of odds to win the ACC, and they get 2 of those teams at home. They go at NC State, but get both Miami and Virginia Tech up in the JMA Wireless Dome, formerly the Carrier Dome. To break it down even further, over the past 3 years, Syracuse has 16 losses to ACC opponents. 10 of those 16 losses are to Clemson, Florida State, UNC, Louisville, and Wake Forest. Wake Forest is another team that they don't play in 2024 and one that they've had a little trouble with over the past couple seasons. The Demon Deacons beat Syracuse in 2020, 21, and 22. So they don't play any of the teams responsible for 10 of their 16 ACC losses over the past 3 years. They also avoid Notre Dame, who has beaten them in 5 consecutive meetings in 2014, 16, 18, 20, and 22. So to recap the schedule, they start with 4 consecutive home games, don't have a road trip until October. Their non-conference schedule is Ohio, Holy Cross, UNLV, and UConn, extremely manageable. Of the new additions to the ACC, Syracuse plays Cal and Stanford, but not SMU, who has the highest chance to win the conference of those 3. And they don't play Clemson, FSU, UNC, Louisville, Wake Forest, or Notre Dame, who are responsible for more than half of their losses over the past 3 years. Going back to 2023, their starting quarterback was Garrett Schrader, but he went down with an injury in Week 9, and they played with their backup quarterback, Carlos Del Rio Wilson, in the 7-point loss to Boston College. They played with third-string quarterback Dan Villari in the 9-point loss to Georgia Tech, and then they needed fourth-string quarterback Braden Davis for the bowl game. So 3 of their 7 losses were without starting quarterback Garrett Schrader. The third-string quarterback, Dan Villari, was primarily a tight end for Syracuse last season. So needless to say, they weren't in the best situation at quarterback down the stretch due to a few injuries. However, moving on to the 2024 roster, the starting quarterback for Syracuse will be Ohio State transfer Kyle McCord, who threw for 3,170 yards, 24 touchdowns, and just 6 interceptions last season for the Buckeyes. He was 229 for 348, completing 66% of his passes. He led the Buckeyes to an 11-1 regular season record, with their lone loss coming by 7 on the road to the eventual national champion Michigan Wolverines. McCord threw for the second most yards of any quarterback in the Big Ten, behind just Maryland's Taulia Tagovailoa. He was number 1 in the Big Ten in passing yards per attempt at 9.1, and number 1 in the Big Ten in total yards per play at 8.2. He was third in the conference in passing touchdowns with 24, and gives Syracuse really a great option at quarterback to fill the gap left by Garrett Schrader, who left after a 5-year career that started at Mississippi State in 2019. And even though last year with the Buckeyes was the first season that McCord was really the guy in Columbus, he was there for a total of 3 seasons. He was a freshman in 2021 and sat behind CJ Stroud for 2 years. So this will be McCord's 4th season being a college football player, and he brings some experience similar to that of what they had in Schrader. At wide receiver, they brought in Justice Ross Simmons from Colorado State, who had 71 receptions for 1,148 yards and 6 touchdowns, averaging 16.2 yards per catch in 2 seasons with the Rams. They also brought in Georgia transfer wide receivers Zeed Haynes and Jackson Meeks. And I briefly touched on it earlier, but Syracuse's new head coach is Fran Brown, who is the Georgia defensive backs coach the past 2 seasons. So Haynes and Meeks and a couple other guys, which I'll talk about in a second, joined Brown in going from Athens to Syracuse. Haynes was a 4-star recruit in the class of 2023 and was the number 2 player in Pennsylvania. He had a 40-yard touchdown in the Orange's spring game and appears to be working into a likely starting role for them this fall. They lost wide receiver 1 from last season in Damian Alford, who transferred to Utah, but returned wide receivers 2, 3, 4, and 5 in Umari Hatcher, Donovan Brown, LaQuint Allen, and Dan Villari. Dan Villari, who also played quarterback for them when they were in dire need, like I said, down the stretch. But yeah, he was primarily their tight end. The most notable part of this receiving core, however, is hybrid wide receiver / tight end Aronde Gadsden, who played in just 2 games last year before suffering a season-ending foot injury. In 2022, Gadsden had 61 receptions for 975 yards and 6 touchdowns, and is poised to be a major weapon again for Syracuse this year if that foot can stay healthy. So that's something to put into perspective for last season. Virtually all of what they did was without their best receiving threat, and then down the stretch they didn't have their starting quarterback for several weeks and still managed to have 6 wins. And that was against a much more challenging schedule than what they'll face this fall. And another piece of that wide receiver core to look out for is Trevor Pena. He's 6 foot, 190, crazy fast receiver, and was going to be their primary punt returner last year before he suffered an injury as well. At running back, Syracuse returns their starter in junior LaQuint Allen, who accounted for 1,274 total yards and 10 total touchdowns last season. Allen was involved in 283 plays from scrimmage last year. That number combines his rushing attempts with his receptions. Those 283 plays from scrimmage were the most by any player in the ACC and the 7th most by any player in the FBS. So he was a guy that they leaned on heavily last year, has a lot of experience, and could be ready for a breakout season in 2024. In the transfer portal, they landed Washington's Will Nixon, who had 33 carries, 285 total yards, and a touchdown last season for the Huskies, averaging 6.1 yards per carry. That rushing touchdown was a very important one, too, for Washington. Nixon scored against Arizona, a game that Washington won by 7, 31-24, on the road to keep their college football playoff hopes alive. They also added 3-star recruit Yassine Willis, who is 6'1", 215, and they landed him over Michigan, Penn State, Kentucky, and Rutgers. He was a top 10 player in the state of New Jersey. Along the offensive line, they added some serious size in Colorado transfer Savion Washington, who is 6'8", 320, and Howard transfer Demetrius Weatherspoon, who is 6'7", 335. So they also got a lineman from Georgia in Joshua Miller as well. On defense, the Orange landed defensive back Marcus Washington from Louisville, who also coincidentally started his career at Georgia. As a recruit, he was a 4-star and a top 150 overall player. They landed Notre Dame transfer DB Clarence Lewis, who will be a fifth-year player this fall. He had 124 total tackles and 3 interceptions with the Irish, including a 33-yard pick 6 last season. They also got back Deuce Chestnut from LSU. This is one of the strangest scenarios I've seen while previewing teams, but Chestnut played for Syracuse in 2021 and 2022, transferred to LSU for 2023, and will be back with the Orange in 2024. In his 2 seasons at Syracuse, he had 83 total tackles, 9 pass deflections, 4 interceptions, and a pick 6. And he played in just 2 games for LSU last year, but one of them was against Florida State, and he had an interception in that game too. He picked off Jordan Travis. So they're getting a seriously high potential asset with Chestnut back in the secondary. At safety, they landed Buffalo transfer Devin Grant, who had 79 total tackles, a forced fumble, 2 fumble recoveries, and 5 interceptions last season. 2 of those interceptions were pick 6s, and this stat is insane. He had 167 total return yards after interceptions, averaging a 33-yard return after picking the ball off. So not only was he elite at covering, anticipating routes, being in the right spot, all that stuff, he also knows exactly what to do when he gets the ball. He led the MAC in interceptions, and those 5 picks were tied for the 6th most in the FBS. On the defensive line, they added 4-star Texas A&M transfer edge Fadil Diggs, who was the number 56 overall player and number 7 edge in the transfer portal this past cycle. He'll be a 5th-year senior this fall. He's 6'5", 260, and accounted for 64 total tackles, 16 tackles for loss, 8 sacks, and 3 forced fumbles over the past 2 seasons for the Aggies. That's a very key piece to watch for the Orange this fall. Another major addition is 4-star recruit King Joseph Edwards, who is not only an elite player, but also might make the all-name team this summer. King Joseph, all one word, no space. But he was highly coveted. He was a 4-star that Syracuse got over Alabama, Colorado, FSU, Georgia, Michigan, and Ohio State. Additionally, they're getting Alabama transfer defensive lineman Isaiah Hastings, who is a 4-star in the class of 2022 and the number 23 defensive lineman in this past year's transfer cycle. At linebacker, and this is just on defense in general, but they returned their top 4 tacklers from last season. Marlo Wax had 110 tackles, 11.5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, an interception, and 4 forced fumbles. He's back. Justin Barron had 90 total tackles, 5 tackles for loss, an interception, 7 pass deflections, and 3 forced fumbles. He's coming back. Derek McDonald had 67 total tackles, 4 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, and a fumble recovery. He's back. Elijah Clark had 66 total tackles, 4.5 tackles for loss, 1 forced fumble, and 2 fumble recoveries, and he's back as well. Syracuse had the 57th ranked defense last season, allowing 25 points per game. So right around middle of the pack, not bad, not great, and that was against better offenses, presumably, than what they'll be seeing this season. And as an overall unit, I think they've greatly improved from where they were last year. Head coach Fran Brown will be in his first season as the main guy, his first season as a head coach, but he had a few years to learn while he was at Georgia from Kirby Smart, one of the best coaches in all of college football right now. Brown showed from day one that he can turn things around for Syracuse. They hired him just days after the end of the regular season. I think it was still in November when they made the announcement. I think November 28th. But I remember pretty vividly him taking over, and then in the span of like 3 weeks, I think it was 20 days or something like that, they offered King Joseph Edwards, got him on an official visit, and had him committed to Syracuse all in a very, very short period of time. And like I said a minute ago, that was over schools like Alabama, Colorado, Florida State, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, Tennessee, Texas, Oregon. This guy had offers from everybody. And I remember seeing that and thinking, well, that was pretty quick and very impressive. And then he got McCord from Ohio State, Diggs from Texas A&M, Chestnut back from LSU, Haynes from Georgia, Hastings from Alabama, Lewis from Notre Dame, the best DB in the MAC in Devin Grant, and that was all quite literally in about a month after he got hired. So he immediately got to work, and in my opinion, has Syracuse in position to really turn things around. So to wrap things up, if there's anything that I want you to take away from this, here are the main points. Here are the cliff notes, if you will. Syracuse currently has the easiest schedule of any team in the Power Four, according to the ESPN FPI projection. Their non-conference schedule is one of the most manageable that I've ever seen in Holy Cross, Ohio, UNLV, and UConn. They avoid Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, Louisville, Notre Dame, and Wake Forest. Those teams are responsible for 11 of their 17 losses over the past 3 years. They also don't play SMU, one of the better additions to the conference that they got with all the realignment last summer. They get multiple players back from injury who didn't play at all really last year and who will be major contributors this fall. They killed it in the transfer portal and are also 16th in the FBS in returning production, with 72% returning from last season. And while for most college football fans the words Syracuse and ACC Championship or Syracuse and college football playoff likely aren't ever being used in the same sentence right now, but Fran Brown and the Orange are closer to those things becoming a possibility than most people really know. And if Syracuse being involved in the conversation for the ACC Championship or a spot in that 12-team college football playoff still seems too far-fetched, or you just can't quite picture it, look back to 2018. In 2018, Syracuse went 10-3. They finished AP number 15. They beat number 16 West Virginia by 2 touchdowns in their bowl game. And that season, Syracuse was 1 play away from beating Clemson in Death Valley. And Clemson went on to win the national championship that year, going 15-0. Syracuse ultimately lost by 4 to the Tigers, 27-23. But if they had held on to their 10-point fourth quarter lead and beaten Clemson, both teams would have been 7-1 in conference play that year, and Syracuse would have had the head-to-head tiebreaker, winning the ACC Atlantic and going to the ACC Championship game. So, granted, that game included Trevor Lawrence not playing the second half and Clemson being on their third-string quarterback, but that's just how it is sometimes, and Syracuse can tell you all about that just going back to last season. So, even with that loss, Syracuse finished AP number 15, so if a 12-team college football playoff existed in 2018, the Orange were literally 1 play away from already having an appearance in it. And had they beaten the ACC Coastal Division champion after beating Clemson, hypothetically, if they went on to the ACC title and beat Pitt, they would have had an auto bid to the top 4. And they lost in overtime in the regular season to Pitt, so it's pretty feasible that they could have avenged that loss and beaten them for the ACC championship. Now, obviously, it's a different team, a different coach, and different time, but it can be done at that program, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them in the conversation in December. That's about all that I had for this episode. Really appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or follow wherever you're listening on podcast, and make sure to come back next time for some more college football content. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.